Hey, welcome to the channel. Today we're starting a new series called Blender for Beginners. So if you've never touched Blender before, here's a great place to start. I'm going to give you a few tips and tricks, and then we're going to dive right into some fun projects. So let's get started. All right, the first step is to go to blender.org, and you can go ahead and click on this download button to download Blender 4.0. Then you'll be brought to this page. You can go ahead and download Blender. There are other options for Mac or Linux. Click on download, and I'm going to assume maybe you haven't used Blender before, but I'm going to assume that you've used a computer before. Just unzip the file and go through the install process. Now, the one downside with this is that it doesn't update, and maybe that's what you want, but there are a couple other ways we can download this so that it automatically updates. One way is through NVIDIA's Omniverse app. You can go over to the Exchange, you can look for Blender, download it, and then you will find it in your library, and you can just launch it from there. The main reason that you may want to do it through this is NVIDIA has this audio to face program where you can rig up a character's face to go along with some dialogue that you've recorded. Markham 3D has a great video on this. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to pursue that further. But for now, you're probably not going to need that when you're just getting started. So you might set that off for later. And the last way for me, but certainly not the only way, is through Steam. If you already have Steam on your computer, you can look for Blender, go ahead and download it. It's really nice because it'll automatically be updated every time there's an update, so you don't have to worry about reinstalling Blender. It also has this neat little timer that'll tell you how much time you've put into it. All right, with that, let's just go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we are in Blender, and my goal for this is just to teach you the basic navigation, go over a few of the settings in here, mention a few add-ons that come in with Blender, and really just to get you started and going as quickly as I can in the simplest way possible. So when we first open up Blender, we have all these file types. These are just templates of different things that we can do in Blender. We have some recent files. Most people just click to the side here, and now we're in Blender. So your first question is, how do we navigate in Blender? How do I move around? Well, if you look over here to the right, we have this little navigation wheel here. I can click on one of these dots, and it'll take me to that view of that axis. So here's a top view, here's a side view. And if I just click and hold in here, I can rotate around my object. I can click and hold on this zoom, and moving my mouse, I can zoom in and out. I can do the same thing for the pan here. I can go left to right, pan around. I have my camera. This will take me into my camera view, and this is what Blender will be looking at for when we render out a video or an image. It'll be looking through here, not your whole screen. It'll be looking through the camera. So we're going to have to move our camera to set up anything that we want to render out. And then we have this, switch from perspective to orthographic, and I don't really ever use this. It's not used an awful lot. Some things you might use it for, but you could switch from perspective, which we're in, to this orthographic, kind of an isometric view. So I can go ahead and switch out of that. Now, if you have a 3-button mouse, which is the preferred method of using Blender, navigation is really easy. I can use my middle mouse button, my scroll wheel, to zoom in and out. If I press and hold it, I can rotate around. And if I hold Shift and press it, I can do a pan. So that's basic navigation. If you do not have a 3-button mouse, one, I suggest you get one because it's really handy. If you have a laptop or something and don't have a mouse, what you can do is you can go to Edit, Preferences, and then in Input, there is Emulate 3-button mouse. So let's go ahead and see that. So what that'll do is that'll make your left click, your left mouse button, act a lot like your middle mouse button. So if I hold Alt and left click, then I can rotate around. If I hold Control Alt and left click, now I have zoom. And if I hit Shift Alt, left click, then I can do the pan. I'm gonna go ahead and turn that off since I don't really need that. Another thing to note in here though is emulate number pad. If you don't have a keyboard with a number pad on it, which is used a lot in Blender for changing your view, you can emulate that. And that'll make the number keys right above your letters act just like the number pad. So let's go over the number pad. So the other way we can change our view is with the number pad. A quick tip, if you're using a laptop, sometimes you have to put the number lock key on before this will work. I noticed that when using my laptop, the number pad would not function correctly unless I had the number lock on. But let's go over the views. In 1, we'll give you a front view. 3 will give you a side view, and you can see it move over here. 7 gives you a top view. 5 is the orthographic and perspective switch. So you can see that there. 8, 2, 6, and 4, these are just incremental rotation. And 9's an interesting one. It'll switch the view that I'm currently on. So if I need a bottom view instead of a top view, I can hit 7 to go to the top, and I can hit 9 and it'll swap me to the bottom. So that comes in handy a lot, especially when you are trying to move something or trying to make an adjustment, you can go to a side view, and then it makes the motion much easier than trying to get it precise in a 3D perspective. So speaking of movement, now that we know how to kind of move around and navigate, how do we move our object and manipulate it? Well, over here on the left-hand side, I have my options to do that. So I can select my object and I can click on move. Here's a little move tool, so I can move it along the axes. I can just click on this little dot here and I can kind of free move it. We can go ahead and undo that. I have rotate, same kind of deal. Rotate it around. I have scale, which means I can make it bigger in all the directions or just one. And then we have transform. That's kind of just a combination of move and rotate. But there's a much easier way to do it, and that's the preferred way, is using shortcuts or hotkeys. So if I want to move this, I can just hit G for grab, and now I can move it around. If I only want to move it one direction, say I only want to move it on this X axis here, and I don't want it to move further back or further forward or up or down, I can just hit X and that'll lock it to the X axis and I can move it only on the X. I can do the same thing for the Y. I can hit G and then Y. Now I'm moving it there, or I can do Z. And I don't have to hit G again. If I messed up and hit the wrong key, I can just switch between them, X, Y, Z. I don't have to hit G again. To cancel a movement, I can either hit my escape button or I can right click, and that'll just undo it and move it back to its original location. So we have G for grab. The other two are similar. We have R for rotate. I can rotate it and I can lock it to X or Y or Z. And then lastly, I have scale, which I can make it bigger or smaller. Again, I can do that with the X, the Y, or the Z if you prefer. There's also another thing I want to mention is we can move it on 2 and exclude 1. So say I don't want this to go up and down, but I want to move it somewhere on this X and Y plane. So I do G for grab, and if I hit Shift Z, that'll say that I cannot move it on the Z, but only X and Y. So I hit Shift Z, and there it's just moving it around on the floor. So that's how we can move around. Again, I could do that with scale. Instead of making it bigger, I could hit Shift Z, and now we're just stretching that out on the X and Y. And if you need precise movement or a precise change, you can type in a number after you do it. So if I want to make this cube, say 5 times bigger, I can hit S. Let's hit Shift Z. So now it's only X and Y. I don't want to make it 5 times bigger. I just hit 5. And if I need to undo that, I can always hit backspace. Say, oh, I didn't want it to be 5, I wanted it to be 6. I'll hit backspace to undo that 5. Hit 6 or 9 or 10 or, whatever we need. And you can also add in negatives if you need to move in a certain direction. So if I hit G, X, I start moving it this way and I say move 5. Well, I moved it in the wrong direction. I can hit negative and it'll swap it. And it doesn't actually matter whether I push the number first or the negative sign first. It'll do it the same way. So if I hit backspace twice to get rid of that negative and 5, I hit G, X, negative 5. And it'll move it right there. A quick little note on that is you can actually see what you've input over here in the top left. I hit scale, Shift Z like I was doing before, hit 5. You can see I'm locking global Z. It tells me what I'm doing. I can hit negative, there's my negative, and I hit backspace to get rid of that negative. Maybe get rid of that 5 and I type in 10. See, I have 10 there. So my input will be up here at the top left. One thing else to note is when I do something like hit G to grab, down at the bottom, you can see all these different shortcuts and different actions that I can do. So there's some handy tools and tips down there. Okay, so that's navigation. This is how we move our object. How do we manipulate it? So that just moves it around, resizes it. How do we reshape this? Well, there are 2 main workspaces in Blender, object mode and edit mode. Right now you can see we're in object mode. So I can just move this around and I can resize it and I can add in more objects, but I can't manipulate the mesh and make this something different. To do that, I have to go into edit mode, and I can either go down over here, this drop down, and hit edit. Now I'm in edit mode, or I can hit the tab key to switch between the two. Here in edit mode, I can start manipulating these edges and these vertices and these faces. How do I select those? Well, up here, I can do a vertex selection. I can do an edge selection, or I can do a face selection. And the shortcuts for those are actually 1, 2, and 3 right on top of your keyboard there. So I can do 1, select a vertex, 2, select an edge, 3 to select a face. And then I can go ahead and use the keys that I used before, I can hit G, and I can move this around. If I do an edge, then I could use things like scale or rotate. Same for a face. I could scale that up. I could rotate it. And if I ever need to delete something, I can hit X when I have it selected, or delete, and it'll bring up this little menu. And then I can have some options. I can just delete the vertices, all the vertices attached, edges or faces, only the faces. So if I hit only face, it'll only get rid of that top part and not all these edges as well. You don't need to know about all of these things right now, but just enough to know that they're there. So if you ever need to manipulate this a little bit more, then you can. All right, so now that we're in edit mode, what else can we do? Well, there are a few tools that you will use frequently, mostly loop cuts and extrudes. So extrude is pretty easy. If I grab an edge, let's say I grab an edge, I can hit E to extrude. I can extrude an edge out, and again, if I need to lock it to a certain direction, I can hit Y. Now we have it locked on that plane, or maybe it's X. In this case, X doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but maybe Z. Let's go ahead and undo that. I can do the same with a face. I can even do it with a vertex, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to extrude a vertex out unless you're just trying to make a line and fill it in later. But I can do a face. Let's extrude this out. I can extrude it, shrink it down, extrude again, rotate. However you want to manipulate this, that is one way you can do it. The other main thing that you might do is do a loop cut, and this is with Control R. You can see that brings up a line here along one of these directions, and I can just left click to set it down. If I want it right in the center, I can right click, snap it there. Now I have placed a loop cut. You'll also notice there's a little box down here. This happens with some of the tools. I can expand that and I can say number of cuts, and I could increase it a whole bunch if I need to. Let's just do one for now. And now I've put in a loop cut. Now I have split that face, and I can extrude that and do what I need to. This is a little bit more controlled method than just selecting this and doing a right click and doing a subdivide. Subdivide is going to cut it both ways. So a loop cut will go around. So it offers you a little bit more control. By the way, if I wanted to select everything and just add more faces, I could hit A. A is to select everything, right click, subdivide. Now this is a bunch of smaller cube faces. All right, so that's extrude, that's loop cuts. One other that you might use will be inset. So if I select a face and I hit I for inset, I'll add this little inset face. And then of course I can hit E to extrude, and I don't have to extrude up. I can even extrude down. And there we go, we have a little box with a hole in it. But that gives you a pretty good idea of how to manipulate things. All right, so we've gone over navigation and we've gone over how to manipulate an object. Let's go over how to add more objects in, and we'll cover this outliner here. So to add more objects in, of course, you can go to add, and this will have a whole bunch of things. And under mesh here, as are most of my shapes, we have our cube and our couple spheres, cylinder, cone. We have our monkey. This is Suzanne the monkey. I'm going to go ahead and put her off to the side here. This is our little Blender mascot. The other way you can do that besides going to add is hit Shift A, and that'll bring up the same menu. For our meshes, we have our lights, our camera, and this is how we can add in more objects. And of course, if I hit A, I select everything in my scene. You can see it's selected in this outliner as well. If I go into edit mode, it's just going to edit that one object that I'm in. So now would be a good time to talk about this outliner here. I'm going to go back to object mode. Some things I want to show you here are a bit of navigation. So we have all our objects here. We also have collections that I made. I just right click, new collection, and then you can drag objects in and out of collections. I can always double click on it and rename it, which I should probably do not to confuse myself. But I want you to notice here that if I select something here, it selects it out here. And same goes for this. A navigation trick here is if let's say I have a cube collection, I have a sphere collection, I click on my sphere, I don't know where it is. I can't find it. Now it's easy to find here. I just have to open this up and it'll show me here. But if I have these closed or I have hundreds and hundreds of objects in my scene here, it might be kind of hard to find. What I can do is I can use the period key on the number pad, or full stop as some people say, and I can use it to find my item in my outliner. So I select it here, I come over here and I hit period, and it'll pop that open here and show me where that's at. Same with this. I clicked on the sphere here. I don't see it in my scene, but I have it selected. So if I come over here and hit my period key, it'll zoom right to it. There it is. I can find it. Now, if you're having trouble fitting everything in your screen and you're zoomed way over on something and you can't find it, you can hit the home key and it'll frame everything in the scene for you. So that's a really handy trick. Another thing you might notice is when we're navigating, let's say I want to zoom in on this cube and I am having a really hard time zooming in on it. And in fact, I can't really navigate around it. It's almost as if I'm zooming in on this one. Well, that's because I am. Whatever I've hit that period key on last will kind of become my active object. And that's the one I'm going to orbit around and move around. If I need to, if I'm having trouble getting, say, this sphere down here, just highlight it, hit the period, and we'll zoom in right on that. And now I can navigate around that. This is really handy and something that you'll need to know about. Otherwise, navigation in Blender can be really, really frustrating. While we're here in collections, let me show you some handy things we can do with this outliner. One is, if we have things in these collections, we can just turn them off. And they're gone and they're not in our scene. They're still there. I can turn them back on, but they won't bother me. If I need to work on, say, just these cubes, I can turn that off. A few other things you might want to look at are these two icons here. Now, what are these? Well, these are visibility. These eyeballs are just visibility. If I turn them off, I can turn them off in this viewport here so I can't see them. They're still there. The one thing you want to know is this camera here is for rendering. So even though I have them off here, let's say I go to render, I render my image, there they are. They have popped up, and that is just my camera view. There's nothing, should be nothing in my camera view, but if I render it, they're there because I have these on. Now, if I turn them off, I could do the opposite. I could have them on here, but I don't want them rendered. I just want to see them in my viewport. Maybe I just have them there for a placeholder. Now, if I render it, they're gone. It's good to know this because you can mess yourself up a lot. I have forgotten to turn something off in the render, and then I wonder what in the world is happening with my image. This also applies to things like lighting. If you have lights in your scene, but you don't want to render them out, that can really trip you up. So just be aware that they're there. If you don't want to accidentally select something, you can turn off selection, but for that, you'll have to go to these filters. And here are some extra options. We have selection and we have this viewport. To be honest, I do not know why we have two of these. They seem to do the same thing. I don't really understand that, but we do have the selection arrow that you can turn on. And if I turn that off, now I won't be able to accidentally grab these objects. So that's just a few things to know about the outliner when you're rendering things out. So now that we kind of know our navigation, we know how to add more objects in, manipulate them, kind of how this functions. Let's go over our properties here. And with that, we'll go over a few of these view settings. We have 4 different view settings up here. Let's start off with adding in, say, a material. We have our material tab here, our properties, and let's just add it to this sphere. So when I click on that, I'm on materials, there's nothing there. Let's go ahead and hit new. And I'm just going to call this red. We have a red material. I'm going to change it red, this base color. Now this sphere is red. Or is it? It hasn't changed. Well, let's go to our view here called Material Preview. Right now, we are just in our solid view. It won't show the material. For material, we have to go to our Material Preview. And you'll notice it looks pretty much like this icon. So if you forget, you can always know that it looks like our material icon here. I go to that, and voila, it is red. Now, it doesn't look particularly good. You know, the sphere looks kind of rough. And there's something that we can do that we can right-click on it, make sure it's highlighted, right-click, and go to Shade Smooth, or actually Shade Auto Smooth. And now we have a nice sphere. Now, you're probably wondering what is the difference between those two. I didn't actually smooth this. This is kind of an optical illusion. This is just for rendering in 3D. So if I render this out, make sure it's in rendered. Remember, that'll trip you up. It trips me up all the time. Render, there it is. It's smooth. So what's going on here is if I render it, it will look like this, but it's not real geometry in the fact that if I went to 3D print this, it would actually look like this, and it would print out like this. So you may not be 3D printing anything, but if you do plan to use Blender for 3D printing, just be aware of that, because you can get yourself into a little bit of a jam if you're adding on a bunch of stuff that makes it look really flat and nice, and then you go to 3D print it and you wonder what's going on. That's because the underlying geometry is pretty rigid. So just be aware of that. Let's go through a few other settings here. So we have our material preview. We have our solid preview here, which is what Blender will start in. Whenever you boot up Blender, it'll start in this mode. And that's just to help your computer to run faster. We also have wireframe, which will just get rid of the faces and let us see the actual geometry. So like I said, we have shade smooth on, but in this form, we can actually see what's going on. And I also ticked on this X-ray mode. So what's the difference? This is our wireframe. This is X-ray. Where does this come in handy? Well, maybe if you have something, an object inside something else that can help you see overlap. But when it really comes in handy is in edit mode. So we're in object mode. Let's go to edit mode. And I'm going to go to a front view. I'm going to hit 1. I'm not going to hit 1. I'm going to hit 3, do a side view. And I'm going to, let's say I just wanted to delete the bottom of this. So I grab all those, I hit X. Let's get rid of the vertices. What just happened? Well, I just deleted a quarter of it instead of all of it because it would only grab the faces that it could see. So one thing we can do is turn on X-ray mode. And so now I can actually see through this whole thing. So now when I select it and delete that, now it's grabbed everything. So that's pretty handy. Make sure you're in X-ray mode if you're trying to delete a bunch of points, especially on the backside. I don't need that on for now. I don't need wireframe on. So we have X-ray, we have wireframe, we have our material preview here. And this last one is rendered view. Well, what's the difference between rendered and material preview? Honestly, at this point, not a whole lot. And that brings us down to here to some render settings. So right now, the only difference between these two, if I come here, rendered view has scene lights and scene world on. And scene world is just lighting. It's the world lighting and our scene lights. So this little light here. Now, if I go between these two, they're exactly the same. Doesn't make any difference. So the reason for that is material preview is using the Eevee render engine. My rendered view currently, if I go to render, is also using the Eevee render view. No, not the Pokemon. This is the render engine. But I have another choice, and that is cycles. So the two main ones are Eevee and cycles. We also have Workbench here. I've never seen anybody use it. You're pretty much always just going to use Eevee or cycles. Eevee is more of a game engine, kind of gives you a game look to things, and it runs a lot faster. Cycles runs a lot slower, but it'll use the lighting. That's what a render engine does. It calculates the lighting on an object. It'll make it look a lot more photorealistic. So if you want something to look realistic, you will use cycles. And yes, I know there are people out there that use Eevee and they get really realistic stuff. That's phenomenal. For the average Blender user like myself, I am not that skilled and I just use cycles if I need something to look realistic. So I'm going to go cycles. I'm going to change this to experimental and GPU. You don't want your CPU to be doing all the heavy lifting. If you have a graphics card, you want to set it to GPU. So now we have a bit of a difference. Let me go ahead and turn on scene lighting. They don't look terribly different at this point. You can notice a little bit on Suzanne. Probably be able to see a little bit of the graininess too. But you can see that it's subtle on here. But you can see there is a difference between cycles and Eevee. It'll be much more pronounced when you start adding in materials and other lights. It'll really start making things look photorealistic. Our material preview, always going to be Eevee. Our rendered mode can be either one. Just bear that in mind. Some other settings here to note. We have our sample settings and our noise threshold. So if I zoom in here and cycles, you'll probably be able to see a little bit of that noise as I scroll through here. It goes away pretty fast because I don't have a lot in the scene, but that's noise. So when it renders out an image, it's going to render out some noise. It's going to be a noisy image and it's going to try and get rid of that. You can see that pop there. So that's denoising. That's smaller the number, the better image quality you're going to get. Also, the longer it's going to take, a lot longer. So I like to change this to 0.05 instead of 0.01. And then sample settings, so that's how many samples it's going to be taking of this image. So the higher this is the opposite. The higher this is, the better kind of resolution you're going to get. And it's going to be less blurry, less distorted. But these are way, way too high. I would not do those, especially if you're starting out. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to divide by, say, 8. I'm just going to come in here as well, divide by 8. So this is your viewport. So this is what we're seeing here, how clearly you see it kind of in real time. And this is your rendered. So when we render it out here, and you can see, like, here's our samples. If I had this at 4,000, it would take a really, really long time. Here, it's already done. That's my image. Took like 5 seconds. If I were to crank that up and turn my noise down, it would take a lot longer. So there's one tab. Here is where you can set your resolution. So if I wanted a 4K image instead of a 1080p image, I could do that. Here is our frame range for if we're doing a video instead of just an image. So you're going to use these two a lot. You're also going to use, if I click on this object, this modifiers tab a lot. This one's kind of rough, so if I add in a modifier, maybe to make it smoother. I could add in a subsurf to make it smoother. You're going to use that a lot. These are modifiers. I'm not going to go into them right now, but we will in future videos. So you're going to use these two modifiers and probably your material tab a bunch. Those four. There's also this tab here. This is kind of our mesh data. It doesn't matter a ton right now for these objects, but you'll notice if I go on my light, under there I've got some lighting settings, the power and the radius of it, lighting color. And if I go to my camera, I have the focal length. I could turn on depth of field to get kind of a blurry background. So you will need to know about those settings there. Remember, this will just change with whatever we have. And you'll also notice that they're color coded. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but if I look under here, I have my kind of object, orange, object level. I have kind of my mesh level. Then underneath that, I have kind of my material level. So if you're wondering kind of what the hierarchy is in Blender, it kind of spells it out for you here in some color coding. There's a ton to go over in this, but that's enough to get you started. So I'm going to leave it there. All right, so just a couple more things I want to cover before you go wild in Blender. And one of them is Workspaces. Now you can see we have this outliner here. We have these properties here. This is all modular. So if I need extra workspaces, because you can either do a corner and pull it out, which almost never works for me because you can either go up or down or left or right, and I never get the one I want. What works easier for me is till I have these arrows here, I'll right click and I'll do a vertical split or a horizontal split. In this case, we'll do a vertical. Now I have an extra working area, and just like I can change it here, you can change any of these. That could be the outliner. Let's go back to properties. I can change any of these here. So maybe I want to do the shading editor, which I do sometimes. So here I have my shader. Let's click on my Suzanne here. We have that. Here's my shading editor. Now, this is just kind of like a more expanded view of this. This is simplified view. I'm not going to go into this too much, but here are your nodes. And again, like I said, that home key, if you can't find it, hit home and it'll frame it. But here I can change stuff. And if I want to get rid of it, I can right click here, join areas, and say I want it to expand that way. It'll join that way. And now I'm back to my original. So that's how you can create more workspaces in this. And then you have these tabs up here, which are basically just like presets of tabs. So here's my shading one. Again, I have a viewport. I have this shading area here. I have a few other things. I can get rid of them, join areas, or make more, whatever I need to do. We have animation, we have rendering, we have modeling. I've never really been on modeling, honestly. I do all my modeling in layout. I think most people do, but you have these options available. Mostly I go between layout and shading, and that's pretty much it. So occasionally you need to go into the UV editor, but we won't do that at this time. If you do have a setup that you like, say I want an extra window here, and you want this to kind of be your default for opening Blender, you can go to File, Defaults, Save Startup File. And then any objects that you have in here, any windows that you have, this is how it'll open up next time when you're in Blender. So if you do want to make some changes and customize it some more, then you can. All right, so while we're on the subject of making defaults, let's change some settings here, preferences. These will make your life oh so much better. All right, let's go down to System. First of all, if you have a graphics card NVIDIA, go to Optics. This will let stuff render a lot faster, or you could use CUDA. Optics is, as far as I know, newer and more advanced, so it actually renders stuff, I think, about 4 times faster than CUDA does. And you could at least do CUDA because, again, you don't want your CPU to do all the heavy lifting. If you have a graphics card, make sure you are using that graphics card. The other thing you want to do is go to the steps. By default, and I didn't have it on default, I'm sorry about that. By default, it's 32. Change that to 256. Again, if you didn't know, I didn't explain that earlier. If I do a movement or add a material or something, you hit Control Z to undo it. Just like you would in any other Windows program, you just use Control Z and it will undo it. 256 might seem like a lot, but 32 is not a lot. There are lots of times that I've tried things and I forgot to change that setting, and then I was kind of stuck with what I had started on. So I would highly recommend changing that to 256. Another thing you might do is if you are having trouble, let's go ahead and go in edit mode. If you're having trouble kind of seeing what you're doing, let's say I select sides, I'm just holding Shift and left clicking to select sides. Maybe you can't tell which one you did last, or maybe you have a really dense mesh with lots of points and you can't really tell what's going on, especially if I do something like this. If I mark the seam, where's that? Mark seam. This is for UV unwrapping. Sometimes you may need to do this. It's kind of hard to see what I've selected and what I haven't. So if I go to themes, I can go to the 3D viewport. I can change colors. And not only can I change colors, I can also change, the size. So let's say edge width. I could make that bigger so I can see things easier. Vertex size, I can increase that, and lo and behold, I can see it better. And again, I can change these colors, edge seam. So now maybe when I select stuff, it'll be a little bit more apparent. If you need that, that's there. Just want to show you because sometimes it's hard to see what you're doing. So themes, 3D viewport, that's where you can change a lot of your colors and sizing. All right, and lastly, I just want to go over a few add-ons because it can be confusing. When you go into add-ons, everything here is an add-on that is built into Blender. It's just disabled. And all I need to do to enable it, you can see I have a few here enabled, is just click on it. Disabled, enabled. I don't have to hit install. Install is for third-party add-ons, so if you download, you will install the zip file. You won't unzip the zip file. You'll just grab the zip file, click on install, and it'll show up here. And then to activate it, you just click the checkbox. There are just a couple that you should have on, and I don't know why these aren't on by default, because basically everybody turns them on because they're super handy. The first one is, if you've ever watched a Blender video, you know it's Node Wrangler. Node Wrangler. Node Wrangler has a few things. Basically, it's using the shading tab. If I go over to this shading tab, I can preview stuff. So let's say I want to add a noise texture on, and I want to see what it would look like with this noise texture. I can Control-Shift-Click on this noise texture, and you can see it toggles between these here, and I can see what that would look like on there. So it's just a way of isolating different components of your shader. The other main function is if I click on a node and I hit Control-T, it'll put in these texture coordinates and mapping. And that's really handy because you use that all the time. If your texture is getting stretched in a weird way, it's a way to fix that and do other options as well. So that's Node Wrangler. You'll want that on. Almost every tutorial in Blender will use this in some form. You want Node Wrangler. The next one will be Rigify. You want Rigify on, and what that does is just give you more options for when you're trying to animate something. So normally if I hit Shift A, I got all these things here. I have one called Armature, and if I don't have it on, the only thing I have basically is single bone. But Rigify adds in these other ones like animals and humans. I can add in, say, like a horse. There's a horse skeleton for rigging a horse. You can do other ones like human. There's a human one for rigging a basic human. So super handy. Make sure you have that one on. And then I say the third one, last one. There's a lot, but the third one that I think you would want on pretty much all the time is images as planes. What that does is it basically allows you to grab any image that you have and just drag it in. I got this one. I can just drag in an image. Boom. It's an image on a plane. This is super handy. Ian Hubert used a lot for putting people into 3D scenes. So you can put in a movie of someone with the green screen background removed and put them in a 3D scene. And you can do things like that, and it's super handy. All right, if you want to see all of this in action, I have a video right here that you can use to get started. Thank you for watching. Do some dabbling of your own, and we'll see you in the next one.